Today, we'll be creating this particular looping animation. It's a recursive infinite zooming kind of animation, and the techniques used can be used to create so many different varieties of animations. We'll be going through all of the mistakes that I made and the thought processes that I had along the way as I figured out how to potentially create this and just made it look acceptable. So stay tuned and hopefully you'll learn quite a bit. I initially started off by fixing what each cube would look like, because I was just going to copy and paste this particular cube, and I had to do this twice because I initially wanted to make linked copies of the cubes, and then I decided not to go with linked copies in case I wanted to change one of them. However, a linked copy would have worked with the end product that I made. The idea was to make a 9x9 grid or a 3x3x3 grid, and then have one of the cubes made up of a smaller section of those 3x3x3 grids. So I knew that to get this effect, I require one set that's smaller than what I start off with and one set that's larger. Note that this video is sped up to 2.5x the normal speed, and even though it's been sped up, none of the processes have been removed, and this is like the first attempt that I had at making this. It's just so that other people can go through what type of problems might occur when somebody is actually figuring out how to make an animation like this. So right here, I made my three sets: a middle, a smallest size, and the largest size. And then I just wanted to make the loop for the camera. The idea was to parent the camera to an empty and have the empty do the rotation and the scaling to get it to work. However, as I rotated it, I realized clearly something was wrong, and it just did not look correct. So I had to figure out what was wrong. I mean, there was definitely something, and then I had to reevaluate what I was doing, and then I figured out that the smallest portion would have to be at the back of the cube in order for the entire thing to make sense. So I had to reselect it and move it to the other side. Of course, the zooming that I made with using the scaling, which was to make the zoom effect using the empty, was incorrect, and I didn't want to rechange all of that, so I just added in a new empty and redid the entire thing. So now I had something that was perfectly looping. However, it didn't seem right, and it was already on linear. So I thought that, okay, if it's on linear and it's not working, then I should just make it a nice Bezier curve so that it slows down and it almost stops and starts again. But that shouldn't necessarily look like too much of an issue. So I thought maybe I'd have it slow down for only a very short amount of time, which is why I tried reducing the size of the Bezier handles. However, I wasn't able to select the handle properly and realized that it's just easier to remove all the unused keyframes first. So after making it close to linear but still a bit of an ease off, it still wasn't looking proper, so I realized that I just have to increase the ease and hence increase the handles and just make it slow down, probably even stop. So even though that doesn't seem like a seamless loop, it works out better than if it was linear in this particular animation. So I decided to just go ahead with this particular loop. Now when it came to shading, I had a lot of issues because I needed to figure out something that would look nice, and I also wanted to use the EV render engine and not Cycles, because Cycles would just take forever to create this 10-second loop on my laptop at least. So I went ahead with just trial and error of various different shaders that I could think of and just mixing in noise textures with wave textures, Voronoi textures, must-wave textures, just trying it all out to see what works and what doesn't. So you can see I didn't like most of the initial things that I did. So at this point I decided to just figure out the lighting first, because I also realized to make it seamless, the lights and the intensity of the light would have to be the same in the smallest and the largest of the pieces. So here initially I could tell that, okay, I have lighting from one side. When I go to the other side, the lighting seems to be reversing, so I have to create a copy of the light on the other side as well. However, after actually placing it, you could clearly tell that no, it still doesn't look right and it just wasn't looping, so I decided to ignore that particular attempt. Then I thought maybe I should make the cubes itself be a bit emissive. So to do that, I decided that I'd use the layer weight node so that I have just the edges light up and be very bright, so that at least you could still see the shape of the cube. Because if I was to just make the entire thing emissive, then you wouldn't be able to tell the shape of the cube. So I had this, and I thought that, yeah, that looks good. I could change the color and all eventually as I please. But I still had a lot of issues with what this actual shading of the interiors would be. Because now I had the edges lit up, but what do I do about the actual faces? So here I thought maybe I could just have some low emission so that boxes could be seen, but even with that, you still can't see the actual edges that are facing you and things like that. So it just loses the entire 3D effect and wasn't nice. So still had to figure something out. Since I made the initial base material reflective and I was going to switch on screen space reflections during the actual rendering, I thought maybe I could light it up, or if not light it up, because this is EV, it's real-time engine and not cycles, but I could still have some sort of reflection on the faces to make it seem like you could actually see it. So I decided to add in a torus in some sort of a stylized manner and have the torus be an emission. The torus have an emission shader so that it's seen on the cube. So just as I had 3 sets of cubes, the smallest, the middle, and the largest, I knew that I'd have to create 3 sets of these tori as well. Toruses, tori. Not sure what the plural is, probably toruses. I'll have to check that. And yeah, so I made the larger set as well as the smaller set. I used the same scaling factor that I used for the cubes itself, which is whenever I scaled it up, I scaled it by 5, and every time I scaled down, I scaled it by 0.2. The reason that happens is because the size of the cubes was exactly 2 units, so it works out. So now I was seeing that the initial faces were still dark right here, so I thought, okay, maybe I should have an emission at the back. But again, because this is not cycles and it's EV, the emission has to be present in the screen for it to actually show up. The emissive material has to be present in the screen for the reflections to show up. So even having this plane just didn't make any sense. It's not going to actually provide any light to those dark faces. So then I thought, okay, maybe let's just have a single source of light. However, the problem with this was getting the light to have the same intensity in the larger side and the smaller side, which took a lot of time to figure out. So yeah, you can actually see me try out different things and just rerun the entire simulation or the animation multiple times to see that, okay, it still isn't matching up. Certain areas are lighter and certain areas are dark. For some reason, one towards the end of the animation, that side was dark, whereas the initial one was had more light. As you can see over here, clearly the ending has more light than the initial one on the faces towards the side, and I couldn't figure out what was causing that to happen. One of the thought processes that went through this is that the screen space reflections depends on the distance. So even though I had the brightnesses fixed accordingly, because the distance was smaller, maybe the reflections are not accurately, they're not matching up correctly because of this, but even that didn't seem to fix it. So at the end of the day, I realized it might have to do with the power of the light or the size of the light as well, because on the smaller cube, the radius of the light is still remaining pretty large, whereas on the larger ones, the radius wasn't. So I essentially figured out that that is most likely the problem, but shifting from one light to the other just wasn't working. So by trying this particular setup out, by switching off screen space reflections and seeing that difference is still happening, it's still there, I realized that it must be because of the light sources, the initial two light sources that I had. So it wasn't about the power, because I fixed the power accordingly. I scaled it up and scaled it down. So it had to deal with the radius, but I wasn't quite figuring out what radius would work. So what I realized would fix that, since I didn't know what the correct scaling of radius was, because it wasn't working according to the same math that I was using, I decided that maybe I could just use the same light source and have that parented to either the empty or the light bulb, and that way it would scale down automatically to the right size. I also decided to change the initial layer weight to green and not blue, because those were different colors, and I thought it would just make more sense to have everything greenish. And then deal with the light bulb. Oh, even before I thought of parenting, I thought maybe there's a possibility that when you look at the first light bulb, there is a smaller light bulb on the opposite side of the cubes. So maybe there has to be another light bulb on the opposite side of the smaller set of cubes for it to work out. But clearly that didn't work, and I figured out that that definitely isn't the reason by switching off certain lights and trying all of that out. Essentially, getting this part fixed took the most amount of time, and I thought it would be figuring out how to make it perfectly loop, but no, it was figuring out how to make the shading correct too, so that when it perfectly loops, it doesn't look awkward. I also decided to add in one torus for each face, because why not? So this is where I finally parented the light bulb to the camera to see whether or not it actually works out. Even with everything, it still seemed like there was something wrong. So instead of parenting it to the empty, I parented it to the camera, hoping that, okay, now it would work. So here I saw that it was looping based on the first and last frames, but the power was going down towards the end, and then I realized that that's because I had it on Bezier, So I had to scale it up the exact same way that I scaled up the actual animation so that the actual change happens while we're moving and not towards the end. And yeah, with that, it was finally perfectly looping. I decided to save the file, and right after saving the file, I decided to make a test render. Since the test render was looking good, I realized that because we're using screen space reflections, increasing the sample count would make it look better. However, the torus still looked a little bit pixelated, so the pixelated torus wasn't seeming right. I decided maybe that would go if I was to increase the resolution. Instead of having it as 1920 and 1080 as full HD, maybe I could make it at 200%, so make it 4K. However, once the 4K actually finished rendering, just a single frame took this much of time. This is at 2.5x this normal speed, so it took quite some time to actually show up. It still looked pixelated. So I realized that it doesn't matter. I also thought maybe it's because I did 200%, and if I put that the actual 192, the actual sizes, it would work, but no, it didn't. Spoiler, it's gonna come out the exact same, which I already knew, but I still thought that it was worth trying once. But yeah, because it didn't make a difference, I decided no, it's not worth it, and it's just gonna be like that. However, this isn't a wallpaper, it's a video, it's an animation, so that type of pixelation shouldn't make too much of a difference because it's always moving and changing, and it'll look fine in the long run. So having the right directory and everything, it was just time to render the animation to create this particular outcome. It loops, and it seems like it's an infinite recursion, which is something that I wanted to try out. Hopefully you learned quite a bit from here, and yeah, make sure that you watch these other videos, subscribe to the channel. If you want tutorials, please let me know, and I'll make tutorials for all of the different things that I'm making over here. Till then, keep trying, and hopefully you make amazing things using the knowledge that you gain from these videos.